For full accessibility today, it is critical speakers first identify themselves by name before proceeding to speak and mute their microphones after they are done speaking. We have ASL interpreters on screen, and live part captioning is available by turning on subtitles using the CC icon on the lower part of the screen. We will have a question and answer portion during today's session, and attendees can use the Q&A function on the lower part of the screen to type in questions for our panelists. So welcome everyone. My name is Anthony Lewis, and I serve as the Director of Community Engagement for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Thank you for joining us for the first in a series of discussions exploring hate and bias, part of our My Response to Hate campaign. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at hate crimes and bias incidents in Michigan, what they are, and what MDCR, the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, law enforcement, and others are doing in response. As the agency responsible for enforcing civil rights laws in Michigan, we take very seriously every report of bias and hate that occurs in this state. As in other parts of the country, we have seen the number of these incidents, especially in our public schools, escalate in recent years. It is not unusual for us to be engaged with several school districts in a given month in response to incidents of discrimination and harassment. From Bloomfield Hills to Traverse City, Heartland to Kalamazoo, and many other communities in between. Students are increasingly facing harassment, discrimination, and sometimes violence on the basis of their race, religion, sexual orientation, or disability. This trend is alarming and strains our capacity to provide a comprehensive response. Of course, bias and hate can happen anywhere. We know, for instance, that in recent times, Asian Americans have increasingly been the victims of hate and bias in a twisted and racist response to the global pandemic. These trends tell us that we must work to raise awareness of what we're facing now and to find innovative and effective ways to help reverse the disturbing rise of hate and bias in our communities. This conversation is one step in that process, and we're grateful for your attention and participation in this important effort. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, Ms. Dawn Eisen.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy and honored to be here. And on behalf of the United States Attorney's Office and Department of Justice, I want you to know that we stand with you in your efforts to prosecute and eliminate hate crimes and bias, and we are vigorously pursuing that. It is one of my priorities as far as civil rights violations are concerned, and that I've added additional resources to our civil rights unit. We, of course, enjoy in this district a civil rights unit within the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is unique and not often found in many other U.S. Attorney's offices, and I plan to use that to help us to pursue these civil rights violations and prosecute individuals who commit hate crimes to the fullest extent of the law, if we make out the case, and as well as pursue civil rights violations. So thank you for having me. I am looking forward to working with you in this effort, and thanks again.
Thank you, U.S. Attorney Dawn Eisen. Thank you very much. And next, I have the pleasure of introducing our United States Attorney for the Western District of Michigan, Mr. Andrew Burge.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate being able to speak today, particularly on this topic. And I want to talk just for a minute about why it is that we, both at federal law and state law, why we distinguish for special condemnation hate crimes motivated by prejudice. And it's first, it's because there's never just one victim. These are crimes that by their motivation are victimizing a whole swath of our fellow community members. Their efforts to subjugate and create sort of a second class of citizens, and I think this is important to talk about now, their efforts to divide us divide us, pit one against another. And that's why now when we think about how we're going to enforce these laws, that we keep in mind when we're enforcing those, we're reaffirming our common bound with each other, our commitment to a society that's free of division and prejudice. 150 years ago, the Department of Justice was founded primarily to begin enforcing civil rights laws after the Civil War, and we continue to have that as a high priority, just on the west side as on the east side of the state, to make sure that we do have a society without prejudice and that we aren't divided against each other. I look forward to the comments today because it reaffirms one of the reasons many of us joined the department in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, USA Andrew Burge. Thank you very much. And now we'll enter on to our program. This evening we will have a presentation explaining what is a hate crime, what is a bias incident, and what is the difference. And to do just that, I have the pleasure of introducing Assistant Attorney General from the Michigan Attorney General's Office, Sunita Dodamani. Sunita?
Thank you, Anthony. I'm just going to screen share here so that I can put up this presentation. It guides me through. Can everyone see this? I'm hoping it can. So thank you. My name is Cynthia Dodamani. I am an Assistant Attorney General. I'm head of the Hate Crimes and Domestic Terrorism Unit at the Michigan Department of Attorney General, which is led by our Attorney General, Dana Nessel. And so I kind of want to just get right into it. This discussion has to start with exactly what a hate crime is. And this is part of our mission, is to educate the public, to do outreach, and to help people understand exactly what this means when we talk about hate crimes versus bias incidents. And I hope that by the end of my presentation, you will be able to make that determination. So it's a category of crime, really, is how I want to kind of start out with. It's any crime that occurs when a victim is targeted because of their race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, or disability. And the first thing that always kind of comes to mind is it still a hate crime if the perpetrator who is doing the crime is wrong about the victim's identity? And the answer to that is yes, it is, even if someone is wrong. And we're seeing this a lot in hate crimes against Asian Americans. Someone thinks that a victim is of Chinese descent when in fact they're Korean. Now, even if the perpetrator is wrong, that is still a hate crime. The next question we usually get is kind of what about if race and ethnicity is only one of the reasons that a victim is targeted? So an example of this might be, a road rage incident where someone stops their car and gets violent. And, it starts off as a road rage incident, but then it kind of becomes prolonged or more brutal because of the victim's race. And that is still a hate crime. So even if a part of the crime has to do with the victim being targeted because of any of these protected categories, race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, or disability, that is still a hate crime. I'm going to advance this slide to talk about what is a hate or bias incident. So what's the difference between a hate crime and a bias incident or a hate incident? And that's that the crime portion of it is actually something where it's an action that does not meet the threshold of rising to the level of a crime, but that a person is still targeted. So speech that is not criminal in nature. And so we'll talk about this kind of as I go through the presentation. An incident where someone is being yelled at and there's like verbal abuse that doesn't rise to the level of a crime could still be classified as a hate or bias incident. So, the typical examples of what a hate crime is are these sort of mass shootings that we hear about, right? The Tree of Life Synagogue in Pennsylvania, the El Paso, Texas Walmart, where Hispanics were targeted, or in the synagogue example, where the Jewish community was targeted. And we've been seeing this rise, these sorts of huge events. And these are the ones that get the most attention. I'll advance the slide. but really, these things are happening all around us kind of every day. It is insidious what is happening at a level that doesn't receive all of that attention. So like the graffiti that's racist in nature, the ethnic intimidation that's occurring when someone leaves a scary and threatening voicemail at a mostly Black church, or in this example in Portland, where a woman is getting a hijab snatched off of her head. These are the things that we don't see as much press coverage, but affect communities also in a very real way. So there's a question about, this is a typical question, but what's the difference between a hate crime and any other crime? Well, these are messaging crimes, and it's not just an individual crime on one individual. It has a greater psychological impact on more than just that individual. An entire community feels isolated and withdraws when a hate crime occurs. These crimes can be more severe, they can be more brutal, they can be crimes of passion. And so there's an example that I always use that seems to really resonate with people. And that's, if you come outside of your house and you have your car parked in the driveway, and you see this, the picture on the left, which has graffiti, etched into a car, that is going to give you all sorts of feelings. It's going to, you're going to think that this is just kids, what terrible kids in the neighborhood, oh, what a pain that I have to go and get this fixed, this is going to cost me money. These are real feelings. But if you see these pictures on the right, which is graffiti that is racist in nature, right, a swastika, KKK etched into these cars, it gives you a whole different set of feelings. This is not just an individual on individual crime. This is a message and a whole other set of fears and worries enter your brain, right? I mean, am I safe in my own home? This car has been parked in my driveway. Is this one of my neighbors trying to send me a message? Do I need to move? Are my children safe? The impact of hate crimes has all those feelings attached to them. And it's not just the person whose car is damaged in this scenario, it's every other person of color in that neighborhood that feels the impact of that crime. And that's why hate crimes are messaging crimes. That's why they are very different. I'm going to advance the slide. I've been asked to verbally cue when I am advancing the slide. So our mission at the AG's office in the Hate Crimes and Domestic Terrorism Unit is that all of these particular things that I'm listing here, that we investigate and prosecute hate crimes and domestic terrorism. We work with law enforcement to provide resources to do so. We try to educate and train communities about their rights. We train law enforcement about how to identify these crimes, prosecutors how to prosecute them. And we coordinate with local, state, and federal law enforcement on criminal cases. So this inevitably leads to a discussion about free speech, because non-threatening speech is protected by the First Amendment in this country. That means it is perfectly legal and not a crime to do things like post hate-filled views online, or call an official to yell at them, to organize a gathering to promote political views, to circulate offensive materials. This speech might be offensive, but it is protected by the First Amendment. What is not protected by the First Amendment is things that we call true threats. These are serious expressions of an intent to do harm to another person. And so in these same scenarios that you see on the left side of the screen, posting hate-filled views online, if there are no threats involved, these are considered bias incidents and not necessarily crimes. I'm advancing the slide. The difference between crime and speech. So hate-filled speech, as I just kind of went over, is not a crime. It's protected by the First Amendment and the right to free speech. But there is some speech that does rise to the level of a crime. Things like listed on the right, crimes that are not just protected speech, things like threats to school students and employees. We have seen a lot of this in the wake of the Oxford school shooting. Things like cyberbullying, bomb threats, lying to the police, ethnic intimidation, which is a threat to do physical harm or damage to property because of someone's race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, disability, sexual orientation, gender. Things like false report of a felony or making a terroristic threat. These are speech type crimes. I'm advancing the slide. Here's some data. This is a graph that shows you the rise in the last 5-6 years of hate crimes. This is number of incidents. This is tracked by the FBI, and they issue a report every year in November. And you can see this kind of steady rise. And the trend is that these crimes are getting more lethal. So the types of crimes are increasing in severity, of use of force, things like that. So you can see that there's a very distinct trend. And part of that is a rise of hate crimes. Part of that is also better reporting that's being done by local law enforcement. And then the FBI takes these statistics and compiles them. Going to the next slide. This is a kind of a breakdown of the bias motivation categories. So what we see from the statistics is that around 62% of these hate crimes are race related. And then around 20% is sexual orientation, 13% is religion. And this other category is 5%. These are things like disability and gender categories, as well as things that are other that don't fit neatly in one of these categories. So I tell you to disregard all of the statistics I just showed you. And I do that because it is a well-studied phenomenon that only about 3 to 10% of these cases get reported to law enforcement. And that seems sort of strange, right? That someone would have a crime committed against them and they're not reporting it to police. But the data is skewed. And how do we know that this data is skewed? If we don't have the reports, how do we know that it's undercounted or underrepresented? We know that because the Department of Justice sends out these national crime victim rights surveys where they gauge how many hate crimes are committed. And it's very clear from those numbers and the data they compile that hate crimes are extremely underreported. So why would people do that? There are so many barriers to reporting these sorts of crimes. And it always leads to the same conclusion, which is there's inaccurate data collection on actual hate crimes. So there's a number of reasons, but I'll go through a few. There is a lot of, there is a great deal sometimes of mistrust between law enforcement and the community. So I put a couple of examples here. People who are undocumented, who fear going to law enforcement because they fear deportation because of the status, their immigration status, or the trans community, the LGBTQ plus community have historically had strained interactions with law enforcement. They might have a crime committed against them and not report. Or there's certainly fear of law enforcement in certain communities and communities of color. There is a fear. And so these all contribute to this underreporting. Another reason is a lot of times victims are not taken seriously. I'm putting some quotes here, but I have unfortunately heard these things myself. It's just kids, underplaying what has occurred. That, oh, this isn't happening in my community. They're worried about the reputational impact of being a place where these incidents are occurring, or maybe the person doesn't want to make a big deal out of it. Doing air quotes there, but or the media is just blowing it out of proportion, I have also heard. So if you're not being taken seriously and you take the courageous step of coming forward, that detracts from reporting any other instances. There's also language barriers or cultural barriers that can keep victims from reporting these incidents. If you're national origin, you're from another country, and there is a great deal of public corruption where you have to pay law enforcement to get something done, then there might be a natural barrier to you trusting law enforcement here. So there's a number of reasons. So what should you do if you are targeted? And if you're immediate danger, I always tell people you have to call 911 because your local police are going to be the first ones responding to these situations. And I tell them, call 911 first, get yourself out of danger, and then, follow up by reporting to some of the other numbers that you'll see on the screen in just a few moments. But if you're facing a physical threat, you want to run, you want to hide, and you only want to fight as a very last resort. You want to not engage if you can help it. If you're facing a verbal threat, you should call the police. You should write down exactly the threat that was communicated to you, because in the heat of the moment, you may forget the exact words, and sometimes that becomes very important for police to know. You want to have a description of the perpetrator, and want to note what direction they went. If you're facing an electronic threat, if you're facing an electronic threat, you want to make sure that you're not deleting it, even though it's kind of a first instinct to get it off your screen or get it away from you. You want to either print it or photograph it, and you want to contact law enforcement immediately. If you're facing a written or a visual threat, you want to handle it as little as possible. You want to contact law enforcement, and you want to note the date, time, and location of the threat that you received so that you're able to convey that to law enforcement. I'm going to move the slide. And what can you do if you are the victim? This is typically what we tell everyone: report it, report it, report it. Even if you don't know if it's a crime. I try to tell people what is a crime and what is a bias incident, to give them a sense of understanding when to report. But I think it's always important to report, because it's not your determination to have to go through a complicated legal analysis to decide if something is a crime. Report it so that it is documented and you are letting law enforcement know so they know where to direct resources. Save any evidence. Do not wash graffiti down. Make sure that you're not destroying something that law enforcement might need to investigate this crime. You want to take photos of injuries or graffiti or anything you think might be relevant. You want to write down exactly what was said. You want to ask for a translator if needed. You want to tell police whether there have been other incidents in the area, to you, to other people. This becomes important when we talk about dealing with multiple incidents that occur to different people, to establish trends and figure out if that information is usable in any prosecution for the crime. You want to tell the police if the timing of this crime is important. Is there a holy day that's been celebrated on this day? Is there a special holiday? Your local police are usually in tune to different communities in their jurisdictions, but sometimes they don't know the intricacies of exactly, whether there is a specific religious holiday on that day, and that might have some significance to the identity of the perpetrator or to the actual event itself. And so, of course, what if discrimination is not a crime? And I'm sure there will be other people that will talk tonight that will talk about this, but the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, who is hosting us here tonight, deals with discrimination in housing, employment, education, public accommodation. So that's like, walking into a bakery and getting served, or a restaurant. And so you can contact the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and their contact information is listed here. They have investigators, and in some instances, they can follow through with an investigation of complaints. So here are numbers. If you have a hate crime to report, these are different ways that you can, of course, call your local police. You can call this FBI number, or go on the internet. Michigan Department of Civil Rights is listed here, and my office is listed as well. So I think that is my presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Anthony, and I'm very interested to hear any questions and see if I can answer any questions for you at the conclusion of this. Thank you.
All right, Sunita, thank you very much. Yes, we will have questions. We do plan to have a Q&A after our presentations this evening. So please, once again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to drop them into the Q&A box, and we will have get out answers to your questions. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing our Assistant U.S. Attorney from the U.S. Attorney's Office from the Eastern District of Michigan, Mr. Luttrell Livingston, who will be taking us through a presentation regarding hate crime and bias incidents. Luttrell?
Thanks, Tony. First of all, I want to thank our partners at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights for organizing this important presentation. And we're here among friends. We work very closely with the Michigan Department of Attorney General, which sometimes refers cases to us. And also, of course, our partners from the Western District of Michigan, our fellow DOJ lawyers. I'm going to talk briefly about federal hate crimes and also about other discrimination cases that the U.S. Attorney's Office is empowered to take action on. There's one federal hate crime statute. In 2009, Congress passed the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and it expanded the possibility of federal criminal cases based on crimes that happen to protected categories and included for the first time sexual orientation and gender identity. It's named after two men who died, Matthew Shepard, who was a University of Wyoming student who was tortured and murdered because he was gay, and James Byrd, a Black man in Texas who was dragged to his death by two white supremacists. There are three categories of our Shepard-Byrd cases. The first are racial crimes, and those are cases where it's tied to the race of the victim. It actually is tied to our authority under the 13th Amendment, and so it also can include some religion or national origin categories, as long as at the time of the 13th Amendment they were tied to racial characteristics. But in order to commit that crime, someone has to use it to willfully cause bodily injury to another or attempting to do so using a dangerous weapon. Our second category are the non-racial crimes, and it's a similar standard. You're willfully causing bodily injury to another or attempting to do so using a dangerous weapon. But this time it includes national origin, and again, as Sunita pointed to, includes actual or perceived religion, national origin, gender, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity of a person. But for DOJ to bring these cases, they must be tied to interstate commerce. Our third category is similar standards, but it's bias crimes that it has to happen on federal land. We have two big challenges as the federal government in prosecuting crimes under Shepard-Byrd. The first is that it only covers acts of violence causing bodily injury, intentional infliction of bodily injury, or an attempt to inflict bodily injury using a weapon. Now, it doesn't have to be a very severe injury. Cuts, abrasions, bruises, physical pain, all of those would qualify, but it does not cover emotional and psychological pain that is caused because of an incident. The other major challenge that we have, and this is where federal law is slightly different than the explanation we got under state law, is that the crime must be because of the protected category. The law requires us to prove that the crime occurred because of the victim's protected class, that it would not have happened but for the prohibited motive. And these cases often involve mixed motives. The example that was used in the last presentation was, a road rage incident that got extended, and there was a racial or a protected class element. For the federal government, it's more difficult to bring those mixed motive cases. This is a tougher burden that we face, but it's not impossible to bring prosecutions. Last year, our office was able to bring a prosecution from Monroe County, where there was a white man accosted Black teenagers at a beach, and he started yelling racial slurs. Then the person walked away, got a bike lock, and hit one of the teenagers in his face, knocking out several of the victim's teeth, fracturing his jaw, lacerating his face and mouth. And we were able to charge that under the Shepard-Byrd Act, and the defendant pled guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, in addition to the tougher cases that we have under the Federal Hate Crimes Act, this U.S. Attorney's Office also enforces federal civil rights laws, Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and all of these play important roles in combating hate incidents. We're enforcing laws against housing, education, voting, access to public accommodation, employment, and often there may be incidents that are hate incidents that we may not be able to charge as a crime, that we might be able to take action as civil discrimination. And there may even be a crime has occurred, but there also may be a case of civil discrimination that has occurred as well. And we would encourage folks that if you have concerns that there is a violation and you're not sure whether it is a hate crime or a civil discrimination, just report it to us. And our prosecutors and the lawyers in our civil rights unit can investigate and try to determine whether we have something that we can take action on on the federal level. I'm going to briefly talk to you about some of those important acts that we've used to fight discrimination in our district. The Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. It's kind of a strange marriage of land use regulations and regulations for prisons, but it prohibits discrimination and unequal treatment in prisons and in zoning decisions. And essentially in both places, it prohibits the government from using regulations that substantially burden religious exercise. In our district, we've had significant work on under our LUPA. We've had 3 cases, our major land use cases in the last 5 years related to RLUPA. In the United States versus City of Troy, which is currently pending in federal district court, we filed suit to assist a community that's trying to build, to convert an existing building for use as a mosque. In the United States versus Sterling Heights, which is a case that we've settled with a consent decree, we were able to secure the right of an Islamic community to build a new mosque in the community. And in United States versus Pittsville Township, we were able to secure the right of an Islamic school to be built in that community. On the prisoner side, along with our partners from the Western District of Michigan and the Civil Rights Division, we were able to initiate an investigation related to the exercise of group religion in prisons. And we were able to convince the Michigan Department of Corrections to change its regulations that prevented small groups from meeting for religious exercise, and actually to allow greater access for Jewish prisoners to receive kosher meals during Passover. Another place where our civil discrimination comes into work is in schools. And we enforce federal statutes that prohibit discrimination in education. And that's discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability or religion. And also discrimination if the school district is failing to provide English language learners with appropriate services. In recent years, we've investigated school districts for allegations that schools failed to take action to counter student-on-student harassment based on race, religion, and sexual orientation. And in those cases, we're not looking at the actual students who may have done the racial or religious harassment. We're looking at the school, and we're trying to assess whether the school knew about situations and the culture in the school where there was harassment taking place and failed to take actions to counter that. We also investigated and ultimately settled a complaint with the Crestwood School District in Dearborn Heights, where it had failed to provide sufficient English language learner services, despite having a very large Arabic-speaking population among its students and parents. So, to close, there's limited opportunities on the federal side for actual hate crime prosecutions, but we stand ready when the facts are there and we learn about them from whether it's from local prosecutors, from the media, from community members that bring it to us. But we stand ready to investigate those cases. But we have several other means that we can use to fight discrimination in Michigan. And I encourage anyone that has concerns, they can contact our civil rights hotline at 313-226-9151. Or they can also file a complaint at the Civil Rights Division's website, which is www.justice.gov/CRT complaint. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about our important work in the civil rights arena. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you, Latrell. That's, it's like I said, excellent information. And once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to place those questions in the Q&A function, and we will answer your questions at the close of our presentations. Now, we've heard from our state and our federal law enforcement partners this evening, and what are some of those and the laws that are laws that cover hate crimes and bias incidents. But we also wanted to give the perspective, but now we want to give the perspective of the community, its effect on the community, and how does the community respond when there is a hate crime or a bias incident occurs in the community. And for that, I'd like to introduce Cynthia Thornton. Cynthia Thornton is the LGBTQ liaison for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, but more importantly, she's also a community activist. Cynthia?
Thank you, Tony. And good evening, everyone. I appreciate your joining us here this evening as we explore a topic of increasing relevance to our communities of the most vulnerable. As I delve into my comments here, consider this a trigger alert. Some of the things that I mentioned will refer to violent incidents. And we understand that while it's not always obvious, there are people in everyday life who have indeed had such experiences, so that these topics can be difficult to discuss. As Tony said, my name is Cynthia L Thornton, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a lesbian of African descent who has been out for more than 35 years. In that time, my activism has necessarily increased in scope, frequency, and intensity with each passing decade, as the promise of equality has persistently remained out of reach for me and others like me. This not only because we are LGBTQ, characteristics for which we have not been provided protection under law in most places throughout our lifetimes, but also because we are Black and we are women, meaning our lives are lived at the intersection of a marginalized race and a marginalized sex. This means that protections granted to us under law, nonetheless, too often do not extend to us in our lived experience. So it's either silent acceptance for me or activism, a choice which really was no choice at all. For the wrongs my ancestors have borne and all my contemporaries continue to endure, there was no real option for me to stand back and be quiet. No option to trust in a society that tells me to just be patient and wait while my oppressors benefit from what is withheld from me. As a result, when I came to work for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights in January 2011, I presented as my authentic self, clearly identifiable as a Black woman, and introducing myself to my new colleagues as gay. I also brought my activist spirit because historically, the work of civil rights was always about activism in the form of marches, rallies, boycotts. It was about taking to the streets with bullhorns and message boards, about speaking truth to power. Civil rights was always about calling out hate and its progeny, no matter the context of its manifestation, no matter the many masks it tried to hide behind, always aware of the seemingly endless trail of deceit that has morphed in presentation across the centuries to sustain its existence. The reality of this session's lessons remind us of this tonight. Hate is no crime. Only the criminal acts which proceed from hate are crimes. Hence, the life-threatening environment created by hate often is not actionable under law. In innumerable ways, the damage it causes cannot be compensated. Yet if diverse community is to survive, its members must continue to take action even when the law cannot. Community is left to bridge the gap until legal standards are met and then the law can act. As a Black woman living at the intersection of LGBTQ, I know silence equals death, and that hate is both a facilitator and a clandestine excuse for hate crimes. Whether I look to the distant past or at the immediate present, I find an unbroken line of reasons to shout, "Stop killing us! Stop killing our possibilities and prospects," while claiming otherwise, then blaming us for the intentionally placed obstacles which we finally are unable to overcome after the mounting exhaustion of rising to the occasion time after time, only to be told, wait just a little longer. But who is us? Factual narratives of history identify us as the most vulnerable, those with the least power and education, those who persistently and systemically, as a group, have been and continue to be denied access to levers of success identified by society. From the inception of the United States, us has meant stolen Africans and their descendants, particularly those who retain the characteristics that irrefutably declare their origins. Us has meant indigenous peoples and others of color who immigrated to this country to seek opportunities denied them elsewhere. Us has meant women and children, particularly those of color who were denied legal voice and were forced to submit to carnal atrocities perpetrated by the privileged, as they still are today. So us is that community of the most vulnerable who have diminished protections, in fact, even when they have delineated legal protections. This has been true across time, and there is no substitute for community response. Perhaps we forget that the slave rebellions, escapes via the Underground Railroad and otherwise, were the enslaved community's response to the horrific atrocities inflicted on them as the very conditions of their lives. Perhaps we have not recognized that the ongoing struggles of our Native American sisters and brothers is a series of community responses to genocidal campaigns and broken treaties that took their land and spiritual homes rather than share them, that stole their children and their identities. Have we forgotten that the historic civil rights movement was a many decades long community response to lynchings in the form of hangings, disfiguring murders, bombings, assassinations? Do we realize that the change and the persistent lack of accountability for the unjustified murders of unarmed civilians, the body slamming of women, children and persons with disabilities, and other abusive conduct committed against our fellow human beings was collective, repeated community responses, culminating in worldwide outrage for the unapologetic murder of a Black man in broad daylight on a city street by a police officer who knew he was being recorded on video in real time, not only by a civilian onlooker and the body cameras of his fellow officers, but by his own body camera. Do we realize that when an activist and rape survivor resorted to screaming over the radio waves day after day, week after week, that there was a serial rapist in her city and the public was not being informed so that potential victims did not know they needed to take extra precautions and be more vigilant. This was an act of community response. That this was no different than when the community organizations came together in prayer before knocking doors together in vulnerable neighborhoods to inform residents that a particularly heinous crime had been committed and to share pictures of suspects or persons of interest. That this was akin to when groups of activists come together week after week to picket and protest the unexplained death of a woman being held in a jail cell, the apparent flashing of white power signs by that city's firefighters while posing in uniform with the city's fire trucks, the forced resignation of that city's mayor when he declared that he could understand why people become white supremacists. Yes, history has shown us time and time again that there is no substitute for community response. Nonetheless, hate is a nebulous thing. Actions which are a clear outrage deserving of rebellion by one group are too often ignored by that same group when similar horrors are committed against others. As the number of transgender people murdered each year climbs, primarily trans women of color, the numbers rise around the world, including in the United States. The community of the most vulnerable, nonetheless, is diminished. The outrage is less. Broader communities of color have been reticent to take up the fight for trans equality, and many cisgender women do not raise their voices in protest. Nonetheless, there has been increasingly successful community response from those being targeted. The murder of Shelley Hilliard, a transgender teenager, also known as Treasure, unleashed a firestorm from the trans and larger LGBT communities and their allies. Burned and dismembered, Shelley was misgendered and generally dehumanized in death as she had been in life, leading to a significantly increased level of concentrated activism. A key gain was the creation of an LGBT liaison in the Detroit Police Department, which has led to a level of trust and understanding not previously conceived for that department. The trainings, the cultural competency increase have all led to a more safe sense of community and a sense that their lives do matter. Similarly, the creation of Fair Michigan by our current Attorney General before she became an elected official and its work with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office let the community know that there would be accountability. It all starts with community, actions of community, response to the things happening in their communities, even when the police cannot act. We know love is love, but do we really understand that hate is hate? It's up to us to understand that we are all community and for us all to act, whether the law has caught up or not. Thank you for the time.
Cynthia, thank you very much for those powerful words in that presentation. So now I have a question for our panelists, and I believe in either of our law enforcement partners can answer. Does it matter whether any hate or bias incident, or if it rises to a crime, does it matter if it's in person, or when does it rise to a crime, or when could it rise to a crime? When it's via social media. I mean, we've seen a lot of times in school incidents where these incidents have happened, and a lot of the incidents are happening via social media or being conveyed via social media. So is there any differences, or what are the differences if it's via social media?
I could answer that, Anthony, if that's all right. So, so Michigan has a lot of laws, and again, we're talking about the state system. And I know Latrell will talk about the federal system, but in the state system, we have a lot of laws like cyberbullying or threats, communicating terroristic threats. These can occur online, and we have different charges for different things. So things like that are happening in person might qualify as certain kinds of charges, and then things that are happening online could be other charges. So it's a very fact-specific type of analysis, but we do have a lot of available statutes that deal with online behavior.
And
Hello, Terrell?
And Tony, that wouldn't, as I mentioned before, that where the federal hate crime statute is involved, online behavior that didn't result in a physical injury to someone is unlikely to qualify. But there may be other non-hate crime statutes that our prosecutors would look at, and it certainly could still create some element of civil discrimination that we might be able to bring. So the real message is to call us, to email us, talk to us, so that we have the opportunity to respond. And Shepherd Bird doesn't cover threats, but we have other statutes that our prosecutors can use to cover those threats. That it may not be a hate crime, but we can still prosecute it under federal law.
Okay, thank you. And Cynthia, I have a question, real question for you. One of the things you stated is when law enforcement is unable to act. Do you have situations from from a community perspective, or what effect it has on the community when you have a situation where you do not believe law enforcement has acted or can act?
It's absolutely demoralizing for community. We have to remember, we are immersed in this work. We do it day in, day out. Civilians don't have the foundational knowledge. They don't understand oftentimes that just because something is clearly wrong, just because there clearly has been a harm, that we can't always respond, that we don't always have jurisdiction, whether that be the Department of Civil Rights or police department or a prosecutor's office. So the support of community for itself and the reminders that it has always been a step-by-step process, one step forward, two step back, to try and get to the point where action could be taken, where something could actually be defined as unlawful when before it had been accepted. So, from, like I said, from even before the inception of this country, that was the case. And we still have things right now. I mean, there are still people who could be fired simply for being LGBT. We still have the case pending to see if that can change. But as it stands right now, it's a gray area. So as they said, when marriage equality came through, you can get married over the weekend and be fired, the following week. And just the overall sense, the best thing about it is the change in attitudes. The story of the part I didn't mention about Shelley Hilliard is that law enforcement was implicated in her eventual death. Now we have a much different state of mind. Not everybody's on board. Some people are playing the game, but there is that accountability. There is an actual decrease in Michigan. We did not have the increases that everyone else had. So it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. When you get what you need, of course, you're feeling better and more connected to law enforcement, like they really are there to protect and serve. When that doesn't happen, you get the opposite.
Thank you, Cynthia. Sunita, I have a question for you. If during your presentation, you talked about one of the reasons why there often is not, often is not reported. So what are some of the things from from a law enforcement agency such as yours, or what are some of the things we can do to assist, or what are some of the outreach that you have done to assist, or to at least build that, or try to build that trust with those vulnerable communities?
Sure. So I think what we are doing kind of right now, where we are talking to citizens and we are trying to ensure them that we take these things extremely seriously, that we will not treat them lesser, or that they will get consideration. These are the kind of events that have to happen. And so when we are reached out to by community members, the organizations, to do presentations and to do this kind of outreach, we say yes. We want to make sure that communities understand that we take these things seriously, that they will be considered. And I'm hopeful that message is getting out. So we also, and Anthony, you and I are part of something called the ALPACs, the community groups in different regions of the state, where we have leaders of nonprofits that come together with law enforcement, and we try to ensure them that we're taking these things seriously. We are here to listen and to have those contacts. People, if they don't feel comfortable reporting to law enforcement directly, should know that they can go to the heads of their communities, their churches, their organizations that they're a part of, and that information can reach us through another individual. We don't want to ever risk that the information doesn't get to us at all. You don't have to call law enforcement and pick up the phone and call 911 yourself if you're not comfortable with that. But the important part is to get the information to someone who will, because we cannot help in a situation where we don't know that there's a problem. So that's, I think, what we try to do.
Thank you. Well, and I guess this is probably for our, for our federal partners also. I guess this question could go to either one of you. Now, are there protections for the undocumented here in the state of Michigan?
We have many of our statutes that talk about national origin would still protect folks who are undocumented, and the requirements of, for instance, school districts to provide services, language services to those individuals who are undocumented is, if the population needs those services, the schools are responsible for providing them. Of course, we often see that these communities are slow to bring these concerns because of their concerns about their immigration status. But our federal civil rights laws stand ready to defend everyone in the country. But we have to do the sort of community outreach that Sunita was talking about, so that we're a welcome place where someone will come and raise those concerns. Because if as federal law enforcement, we are not a safe place where people from diverse communities can bring their messages, we can't do any work. If we don't, our cases are dependent on the public telling us what's happening. So that's the importance of outreach into underserved communities, including undocumented communities.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. At the Michigan Department of Attorney General, we will never ask you your immigration status. And that is something that I know a lot of large departments also don't do. Detroit Police Department, because we've worked with these police departments to let them know that it's more important for us to hear about the crime, and that is not something that we are concerned about.
And I just wanted to piggyback on something Latrell said about the community outreach. Latrell was recently appointed. I appointed him as our Executive Assistant United States Attorney for that very reason, because we will start being more active in the community and engaging in more community outreach so that we can hear the concerns and try to find these cases, as I said, and pursue them where we find them. So we will be out in the community and all of the richly diverse communities that we have in this great district, and look for us to be out there, and we welcome the opportunity to serve. we want to serve as a resource. And so we welcome the opportunity to do that. And we're going to get out there and make it easy for you to connect with us. I'm committed to doing that.
Thank you, Dawn. And I will also share that I know that sometimes prosecutors may be able to help with victims and witnesses and applying for getting special immigrant status protections as well. It's just an additional tool that we have available for folks who out in the community.
All right, thank you. And now I have a question, and we have a question for Cynthia. What is the status of the updates recommended to the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act to add sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes?
Yes, the last I was told, the hearings before the Michigan Supreme Court were scheduled for early March, either the 2nd or 3rd was my last information. So looking forward to it.
All right, thank you. So we have another question now. I guess is there a particular agency where when a person alleges that their local police or county sheriff's department or they're refusing to take an official report that you believe is related to a hate crime, do you know where could someone in that situation, where could they turn, or who could they contact to report that or to complain?
I just answered that in the chat. They can contact the FBI, or if they don't have any, they have a duty line as well, but they can contact our office. They can contact the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we'll look into that.
Anthony, we also take complaints too. And I know it can be confusing because we've got so many different agencies here on the line, but we all talk to each other and we all communicate really well and we all work together because it's in everyone's interest for all of us to communicate about who has the better jurisdiction, who has the better law to handle this. You know, this is a really collaborative effort, and everyone on this call I have talked to, and we have discussed cases. These are, you know, call one of us, you're calling all of us, essentially.
I can't say enough to echo that. Before I transitioned into my new position, I was investigating a school complaint that went to the Michigan Attorney General's office that they didn't have jurisdiction to really investigate, so they directed it to us. Our education cases, we're often talking with MDCR and Tony on some of those cases. We have joint jurisdiction in some of disability cases, and we coordinate efforts there as well. And in our housing work, we are also working very closely together because of overlapping jurisdiction. And sometimes, you know, if you get it one place, we are able to work together to pass it along to where it is. And often I get complaints that are on the west side of the state. And so we're sending those complaints to our colleagues in the Western District where DOJ has jurisdiction, but we simply don't based on geography.
All right, thank you. If we have, I do not see any more questions in our Q&A box. So I want to thank everyone this evening for coming out this evening. And also, this is the first, as we stated earlier, this is the first in the series of hate bias awareness campaign. We have our next program will be February 24th. And we are looking to see, and it will be in terms of a commemoration from African American History Month, and that will be our focus. Will be the hate bias awareness in the African American community. Also, each month we will be having a program designed with a particular focal area for that particular month. So look on our site, the Michigan, our Michigan Department of Civil Rights website. Also culminating with our annual hate crimes conference, which will be in September. Are there any? So if we don't have any further questions, once again, I want to thank everyone for participating. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank our presenters for sharing this information. As we stated before, this program has been recorded, and this program will be posted on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel for those who wish to view it again. So thank you very much, everyone, and you have an excellent evening. Thank you.
Thank you.